time, and they can go and hear Barry Sternlicht, who was on CNBC this morning talking about real estate, and particularly it relates to offices and hotels. It was actually very informative. So,
what did he say? Quick soundbite.
Well, he thinks that in places like New York, it'll come back, but the rents may drop up to 25% in the near term, and then have to work its way back. That was one of the key elements that he was highlighting. And the other areas like the hotels are going to have a much longer way to go. But he's still in favor of fully opening up the economy, which he's been very consistent on from the start.
Yep.
Because the damage of not opening it, what that does. So worth a listen if you have a moment. As it relates to digital transformation, I really wanted to focus on three things. So first is the transformation really started pre-COVID. I want to talk about the pre-COVID transformation and then what's happened post-COVID, talk about the economic impact, and then we've been getting a lot of questions on the valuations of tech names. So I wanted to share some thoughts on that. So one of the big themes for us has been this third wave, and the third wave as it relates to 5G as the connector for a lot of things. I just want to touch on one element of this because I think it's actually really interesting how it relates to what's going on. But IHS Markets has come out and they believe that 5G goes in the category of the steam engine and electricity as general purpose technologies, which are big game changers. And I used to get a lot of pushback on this slide about it's not 5G, it's AI, but 5G is the enabler, and we'll touch on why that is. So the big factors that were pre-COVID factors driving the transformation really were monetary policy coming out of 2008, allowed companies to borrow at very cheap rates, and the leading companies and those that have thrived in this environment are the ones that use that to improve their technologies to drive down their cost and increase productivity. Then you also had in 2016 the tax policy change, which lowered taxes on U.S. corporations and allowed them to have more money in the coffers to do things with, and a lot of that went to tech. Trade policy actually forced the movement towards reshoring, which we'll talk about and which you guys have heard about a lot. But this new general purpose technology concept is one we think gets underappreciated by the market. So we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go along. So some of the key areas of digital transformation are ones that you guys are looking at to invest in, whether it's in the private or the public markets. But when you look at Amazon, Apple, and Google, and the growth of their market caps and the growth of their revenues, a lot of it is coming from public cloud adoption, and that's a trend that we don't see slowing down, and one that we see really starting to accelerate. One of the other elements that we'll touch on is when you think about the change with e-commerce, and Nancy Lazar put out a report yesterday that had two very interesting numbers around e-commerce. She looked at the growth of e-commerce versus general merchandise and clothing sales from 2012 to 2019. And what she saw was that e-commerce grew at 130%, general merchandising grew at 13%. When she looked at the adoption over the last 3 months ending May, year over year, e-commerce was up 27.5%, general merchandising was down 17.5%. So do you think this is going to revert back to where it was before or continue is a question that we would ask. Cybersecurity has become under much bigger pressure given the post-COVID environment, and the threat levels have gone up for every company, for every user, everyone with a smartphone or a smart device. Your cyber risks have gone up. So cyber crime's on the rise, but cyber warfare is picking up too between countries, and that's something that we want to keep an eye on. I know, Mark, you have someone who's going to talk about fintech, but contractless payments are on the rise. Obviously, people are afraid to use real currencies for fear of transmission. Robotics continues to move, and adoption of that is accelerating. The transformation of producing of drugs in healthcare, the condensing of that period has really shortened things up to a fraction of the time it previously took. Your panels have talked about digital entertainment. I want to take a minute and talk about AI, 3D printing, and blockchain, because the rapid adoption of them and why we think 5G is such a transformational technology is that when you look at three areas on speed, 5G is 20 times faster than 4G. On connectivity, where under 4G, you can connect basically 100,000 devices per square kilometer. On 5G, you're going to connect 10 times that, or 1 million devices per square kilometer. So it allows for greater density. And on latency, the latency is 25 times higher, where you were looking at 50 milliseconds on 4G to 2 milliseconds on 5G. Those numbers are staggering when you really think about how far we've come with technology. But it's really important to keep that in context, because we're still in the early innings of this adoption and development. And as it relates to remote work, the numbers are staggering. And you looked at, everyone knows the numbers, but if you look at Zoom, Microsoft, and Google, the three of those companies on their Teams or Zoom meetings or Google's version of it have added 600 million daily users from the beginning of this year. Not daily users, daily meeting participants. And the difference between that is the way these work. If you jump off Mark's call and jump back on, you counted twice. So that's why those numbers are, but it's staggering numbers when you think about it. Microsoft's adding about 75 million daily users a day. Google is adding 3 million a week. So these numbers just continue to go up. You think this is going to go back the way it is, we would not be in that camp. And when it gets to reshoring, think about what 3D printing is going to do for reshoring, where you can get a much more resilient supply chain and shift from not only being more resilient, but more adaptive and bring things home. So these are key technologies that we think all of these are really in the early stages of it, which makes the next area more difficult. So when we think about the post-economic impact, you have increasing CapEx across all industries as it relates to technology. One of the things we tend to do is think about technology as a sector instead of something that's now covered across every industry, and the way we do business, the way we govern, and the way we live and educate. That's a different context that you have to think about it, and how much of the spending is not just the Apples, the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, but it's how much of the spending is coming from every company that's trying to compete in a world where their revenues are uncertain, greater uncertainty exists, and they have to figure out how to manage costs, because everyone believes that either taxes are going up, revenues are going to be tougher to get back to where we were before. So this is a big growth. And Nancy Lazar puts the tech spend as a percent of CapEx closing on 50% now and rising. We also know that it's going to improve productivity, but that comes at a cost on jobs. But there also, it does lead to other jobs. So there's transitional issues with that. And again, people get hurt and people get helped by that. But tech transformation tends to lead to higher paying jobs, just as every other major transformation that we've had back from the Industrial Revolution to today. I want to just share a little bit about valuation, because this is a topic we get all the time. And I happen to be involved in a startup that does AI for the travel industry as it relates to corporate travel. Not exactly a hot area that you would think, but they've been really accelerating, because the travel companies know that they have to work in a much different environment with a fraction of their revenues coming, which means they have to cut their costs when they're in a thin margin business to begin with such a high degree of lack of clarity about the future earnings. But when you look at even the public markets, you really need to separate the mega caps from others for so many reasons. I mean, look at Microsoft now. It's grown over the last year. Its growth rates have been just phenomenal in terms of both market cap, stock market performance, as well as revenue growth and the like. But it's selling for a 33 multiple right now, with a price to sales of $10.88. If you look at Zscaler, which happens to partner with Microsoft on cybersecurity, that's the symbol ZS. They IPO'd about a year and a half ago and have blown into a almost $14 billion market cap, mostly on the heels of their relationship with Microsoft. They put a ring around your cloud cybersecurity. That's what they do. They provide cybersecurity around Microsoft's data centers all over the globe, and that allows companies to be protected and shut things down. It's not in positive earnings. It has no P/E multiple. It has a price to sales of 35. But the stock's up about 145% year to date, and it's one we've owned basically for about a year now. We've trimmed it down several times, and I think that's the way you have to play these things in this environment, because it's safe to say when you have a 30% decline and a 40% rebound in the markets, things are a little out of joint, and you really need to be very cautious about how you take advantage of it. At the same time, we would caution people not to walk away from areas that are in the secular growth areas, which we think we're in the very early stages of this transformation. And therefore, you want to have to be a little more nimble in how you're managing and moving in and out of your equity investments in this environment. So with valuations where they are, if you own these things, what would you do now? We think it depends on your position sizes and your long-term holding period, but we have actually used the opportunities that the market's given to either trim or replace things based on the volatility that exists. But if you wish you owned some of these but hadn't, what would you do now? We would suggest that people start a position, hope for a pullback to increase it, but not be completely out of investments in key areas that you know are going to continue to attract capital for the long term. So it's a very tricky area. We don't think this is an 99 period. We think that the valuations on a lot of these companies are a little stretched, but not out of the realm of what their growth rates can be and where capital has to flow in this environment. And we also believe that the needs for businesses to be more transformative in terms of moving more of their investment dollars and more of their maintenance spend over to growth investments is going to pay off by reducing their required maintenance and actually positioning them much better. One of the key elements that I'd add here is a quote from Bill Gates on technology. And he said, the first rule of technology used in a business is that automation applied to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. The second is that automation applied to an inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. And I think that's the challenge for people, trying to figure out who can make this transition and who can. If they weren't operating particularly well before, it's going to be very difficult for them to catch up and be competitive. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks. Well, I wanted to bring on a few other perspectives. Any other quick questions, comments on what Stephen brought up before we do? Then I'm just going to move. This is from our bio slide deck. So again, making a plug, please contribute so we know how to connect with each other. So Nisa, why don't you give us your perspective? You've been in the you've been venture overall in fintech of late. So please, what scares or excites you in this area?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Stephen, for your comments. I couldn't agree more. I was really pleased to sit down with Nancy Lazar last week in Colorado and talk through what's happening in blockchain and the convergence of AI, robotics, and other disruptive technologies that have only been accelerated by this pandemic. The trend was happening before, but now you see things like you mentioned in terms of digital assets or digital currencies with the stimulus plan that was discussed heavily on the Hill and is still being discussed in terms of digitizing the dollar, not only from a cleanliness perspective, but also to reach people who are unbanked, to get stimulus money to them. And it's already happening in China with the DCEP and other countries as well. So I think that time has been accelerated by a few years. And in terms of blockchain and fintech overall, I mean, these are technologies that touch every single one of the verticals that you mentioned, from supply chain in terms of food and drugs, you know, to healthcare in terms of fighting the pandemic or tracking equipment or medical supplies, or even before the pandemic to climate change. So a lot of what we focus on is how to use these technologies for impact, and that's what we invest in as well. And then there's also the tokenization of real assets. You were mentioning real estate. That is happening at a more rapid pace now. There is democratization of access to capital, and that is part of tokenizing assets. So that is also having an impact. And we see, in terms of the pandemic resurgence now and the possible additional stimulus coming, that Bitcoin has remained, in terms of the narrative, as an inflationary hedge, and expecting a breakout there as well, but before the end of the year.
So Nisa, sorry, I just want to get a few. That's awesome. Thank you. You hit
Okay,
a
sure.
Brilliant. Nikunj, Jency, you led venture for the IFC up until recently. We talked about emerging markets, but more broadly on the theme of digital transformation. How do you see? You don't have to talk about emerging markets if you don't want, but just what's your perspective?
So, Mark, I think I see my name up here. I mistakenly dropped off just now, and then that came back on. So I guess you're reaching out to me. So thanks. So, look, I think if anything, the crisis has exemplified and it only accelerated the whole digitization process. And I think Stephen and Lisa laid that out very well. My background is in emerging markets, but I'd say in a way that's much of a blueprint of what has happened in developing markets, and in some cases it's even accelerating what is ahead of time in places like China and India, where things are not at that point level out here. There are areas and pockets where digitalization has been prevalent. I name a sector like edutech, education. Not surprising. People want to have, not everybody has a facility to homeschool, and they will want to have access to good quality curriculums for the kids as well beyond that. And so there are opportunities out there. I'd highlight a company called Byju's in India, which we've invested into early stage. And it's now well documented as being valued at over $10 billion, nowhere close to turning a profit. And if I have to do any, guesstimate on earnings multiple or revenue multiple, it would be over 25 to 30, and it's still a private company. But there are opportunities that are happening, which one wouldn't believe would come. But it's a direct consequence, not just of the digitization of what's happening anyway, but the fact that the digitization efforts have been accelerated out lately. The other sector I would highlight is that on delivery and transportation, because the infrastructure is so limited in many parts of the world. And the fact that one could use a data-driven approach towards equalizing and creating more transparency amongst the delivery infrastructure. There are huge opportunities out here in places like Cargo X in Brazil that are able to pull everything together on the transportation side. And as people are getting more used to getting home delivery, as we have now here in this part of the world with Instacart and other folks, similar kind of models are being set up elsewhere in the world. So I'd say in many sectors, it's an acceleration that's happening.
Thanks, Nikunj. Again, I'm just trying to get around the house here. Paul, I wouldn't think of you normally as our tech guru, but you're in the tech deal. So as you do your diligence, what are you seeing? I think it's in the OTT sector.
Yeah, actually, Stephen's remarks remind me of a couple things. He identified some great macro trends that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at investments, but also the current environment causes some near-term questions about where we are in the trend. So I'll touch briefly. So we're looking at one deal earlier on in the process. It's an e-commerce company, logistics, in the logistics space. That facilitates international buyers who want to buy U.S. goods through e-commerce. Their sales have gone through the roof. And the question there is, clearly it's a macro trend, as Stephen said, towards e-commerce, but how do we normalize what's going on right now relative to valuations and stuff, and know whether it's a pandemic-related blip or if this is going to be kind of a continuing sales level. Incidentally, also, one thing to touch on sometime, Stephen, I'm curious about your views, is they, like a number of companies I'm hearing on, are having problems right now hiring because it's for $15 to $20 an hour for warehouse workers. It's cheaper to stay on. People are earning more money staying on unemployment, and so hiring is actually very difficult right now for some companies. Then on the other digital side, though, is this company you referenced, Mark, that we're in deep diligence on, is in the OTT space, which is about streaming internet content onto devices. The number one device being in the case of this company, a smart TV, and that's a macro trend that we're comfortable is going to continue. But like everything, the coronavirus has caused a hiccup in consumer device sales, and so we have to again say, well, we're comfortable with the macro trend that people are going to be buying more smart TVs, and smart TVs were 55% of sales worldwide in 2015, and now they're over 70%. So great macro trend, but we just had a big hiccup in consumer device sales, and when do we think that's all going to normalize on the upside? So it's interesting stuff.
Well, and then one more, or maybe two. Mark White, are you able to join by phone? I think you said you were going to be in and out. And then otherwise, Zach, since you're on from Dubai, you were doing the venture, sort of corporate venture for EMAR, and you've been seeing the venture scene there. Anything you want to touch on real quick? Or we caught you off guard, Zach?
Hi, Mike. Thank you for that. Yeah, I've been just listening in here and there. I thought we'd actually dive more into automation. I was interested to talk about next wave technology, you could say. I'll use time for now. I don't have a comment.
Sorry, I didn't hear it perfectly. You'd like to dive into what part?
I was listening in. I was hoping we'd talk more about automation in terms of like the future of work in that regard. Robotics and AI and that sort of thing. But for now, I didn't have a actual comment, so I'll yield my time.
Okay, fair enough. Well, we will have that. That'll be a deep dive, as we pointed out. Any comments? Other questions? I know that Manpreet is an investor in VC funds. You may have a point of view, or others. Please weigh in. Or questions. Zach Posner, you haven't joined us before, but maybe introduce yourself, what you're doing for the in the legal tech side.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Great to see everybody. From our end, we're the first dedicated legal technology venture capital fund. So we think that a legal agreement kind of sits, at the start of everything we do personally or professionally. And if we stop thinking of that as a PDF and we start thinking of that as a set of structured data, we think there's going to be some pretty awesome companies that are going to be built. One that we loved, if you guys are familiar with venture, Carta is a great example of a company that started out with a cap table, but they've gone so far, they're actually our fund administrator. And we're negotiating a capital call line of credit with them right now. So all that came from a basic legal doc. I think that to the higher level themes that you were touching on, it feels like our space, this is all an accelerant. We think law firms, we think attorneys, we think that the whole process was a little bit behind on the use of technology. That trend was moving in the right direction. Then COVID happened, and it almost accelerated everything. And then, we also cover a lot of things that are direct to consumer, and that includes a lot of justice issues. And, so anyway, that's, I think that's a high level. Yeah.
We need to catch up. Anyone else with a point of view on digital transformation or question?
I just add one thing regarding the supply chain. It's interesting how you can use the same terminology of structured data for what's probably going to happen in the supply chain as well. So we're getting calls from a lot of people who are saying, we can't travel anymore. So what's the technology solution for this? Or why am I using email to manage bill lading information and spreadsheets to track things when this should all be in some type of digital space where everyone sees shared files and things like that. Or I like the term structured data. It's a great way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for the legal venture gentleman. Are you a believer in smart contracts and sort of the technology that supports those?
This is Torn Putnick.
Yeah. Was actually literally was late to this call because we were talking to a company doing just that. So yeah, that's directly in our sweet spot, and we're seeing lots of neat stuff there as well.
I just want to add to that I'm happy to talk about that area. As a lawyer, a former securities and corporate lawyer, and an investor in smart contracts, just reach out to me if you want to talk about that.
That's neat.
Why have some of the traditional banks been so slow to adopt so many of the digital signage technologies? Why are we still held up, signing documents by hand? Why haven't they all adopted DocuSign en masse?
So I'll give one more comment, then I'll let Mark take it back over. But this has been another thing with COVID that it's actually accelerated a lot of policies. So I live in the state of Maryland. In the state of Maryland, I think like 40 days ago, for the first time, the governor announced a proclamation that you are allowed to notarize online for the first time ever. There's a lot of wet signature laws around mortgages. So there's lots of policy things that are due to kind of catch up. And I think that, again, we're seeing COVID, kind of bring I think a lot of that stuff's going to change, but a lot of it's steeped in policy. Actually, it's not just the banks being slow to move. It's more, there's laws that say right now you need ink on certain mortgage types of documents.
I can add to this discussion. I just spent a few days talking to private wealth managers in different parts of the world. And the larger they are, the more obvious there is one single problem. In order for all these new technologies to be introduced, hundreds of departments have to be coordinated globally within one institution. And that means that they have to change the software very significantly. There is not just UI, it is actually the whole internal wiring, which has to be almost completely thrown away, and the banks are not ready yet.
Thanks, Simon.
The only thing I'll add, just because Simon said that, just to remind me, when you get back again to TVs and over the top, this digital transformation is going to change business models as well. If you don't need your cable company to deliver content, Roku can deliver it for free to you, and as long as you're willing to watch ads, and everything's going to change.
There was a theme that we've been touching, Stephen, about really the haves and have-nots, the digital divide. It's too bad. I thought someone from Jobs Ohio. I just saw was it the UN has a new initiative to try to bridge that divide. I know Ohio. Anyone on from Ohio on that subject? I guess not. But that's obviously that's part of the problem.
Mark, it is definitely part of the problem, and I think everybody avoids to discuss it because, understandably, nobody wants to be labeled in some way. But it is a huge problem, which, from financial point of view, at the end of August, we'll have to face if what we see right now on the streets continues and the chance that the current administration loses increases. I think the markets will just panic because what is happening is not definitely helping the markets.
Thoughts, questions, others?
I'll make a comment.
This is Zach again from Dubai.
Yep, since I didn't say anything earlier. relevant to what was just mentioned about banking, over here we have the biggest bank in the UAE, and it qualifies as the biggest bank in the region, like asset-wise. I was with one of their VPs, and like literally he was saying they don't need any branch. They just have, even though they have one of the bigger networks now, it's more so for people that are more traditional minded, but literally you could do everything without the branch, either with their tech solutions or there's something that's a bit regional specific where you could have someone come to you with certain like documents and you sign off and whatnot. I see that could be translated to other markets as well as we go into more robotics and AI, right? Because you could send a robot that verifies like the facial image of someone to some IDs and other like relevant technologies that could enable it. Because I see in other markets you don't have as much delivery service or people coming to you because of the cost of that, and that's being handled by all the robotic trends of AI. So it's interesting because this bank also has been expanding slowly, right? Like they bought a Turkish bank I think last year. So I just wanted to share that. So in terms of like how banking will be moving forward, since it already is here, that you don't need a branch.
Yep. There is a company there's several companies I think are trying to jump into that gap. Any other insights, comments, questions?
On this banking issue, I can also add, we tried to automate as much as we could. We looked for banks to acquire in the digital space, all these neobanks. They all failed. They don't have, none of them exists. And the most digital bank which we've seen so far is Tinkoff Bank. But when we started checking out how it worked, they had digital onboarding, and then they had 7,000 people who were employees of back office and other functionalities. So I agree that some functions, very simple, like payments, can be digitalized. The rest of it seems to be very difficult to digitalize.
And he's referring to Tinkoff. It's in Russia. Anyone else?
Mark, I would just add, I think we underestimate the impact of tech spend on valuation and moats, because if you look at a JP Morgan, I think they're going to spend $12 billion on technology. Citi's probably going to spend 10. How do the other banks compete against that? Their best hope is that they spend it badly and don't get a high return on it. But if you go industry by industry, whether it was Walmart, how quickly they jumped on the jet transaction to get into e-commerce, and how, if you go back and look at the leaders versus the laggards in every industry, one of the key elements is going to be what their tech spend is and was and what it continues to be. And I think people really need to keep in mind that how big a moat is being created by those who are aggressively spending and redirecting money, which is a hard decision from maintenance to investment. Those are very tough decisions, but they're going to be even more necessary in the environment where revenues are going to take quite a while to get back to where we were. So it's mind-boggling when you look at the big 5 tech companies, their spend relative to everybody else, or the best banks or the best retailers. It's industry by industry. They all have that competitive edge and are using it for that.
Well, it's too bad Elliot from Facebook's not on, because I think it was since he spoke, Zuckerberg took a hit. I don't know how Facebook has done in the last couple of days. It just seems to me like they don't have many legs to their stool, unlike a Google or an Apple. Am I wrong? You're muted.
Facebook's harder to figure out because of the way this is steamrolling right now. It depends on whether they can harness it fast enough. The big companies are doing it, I think, as much for their own PR as it is for their belief system. Not to knock all the big companies and say they don't have strong belief systems, but it's an easy decision to say, let's pull back and let the dust settle and see where they go. But the number that they have, I forget who, yesterday was Unilever. I think it's $115 million of revenue to Facebook in a $50 billion revenue line. So if you get enough of those, it adds up. But I think context helps too. Facebook's pretty diverse and are finding new ways to get engaged. So I don't think you can bet against the innovation of the tech leaders. And the other thing is their spend on acquisitions. If you just go back and look, each one of them in the last week has done a couple acquisitions, at least one, if not more than one, bolt-on acquisitions for future revenue streams. And they can do that where the companies that, because of the wealth gap between companies, they can't. And I think that's something that we underestimate when people are thinking they can't keep going on the way they're going. So it makes it a tougher way to figure out valuation, but it's I think it's something we underestimate again.
Anything else on digital or any other theme? Doesn't have to be about digital. What are we seeing that excites and scares? Well, if not, let's move on to our day jobs. And hopefully this was helpful. Again, just keep in mind future dates. We're going to be gearing up for the 30th. Next week is about higher education. We'll have at least one college president talking about the challenges and opportunities there. We're going to try to bring some people. Joe Jarabek helped me on the K through 12 side of things as well with charter schools, which you can, depending on what you think about it. And then we'll have at 11:30, we'll break for an alumni connecting piece of it. And then Simon, you'll, and others, you'll take the lead on some of those deep dives, and we'll work with you. And if anybody wants, has questions or suggestions, let me know. Or as my wife says, feedback is a gift. So gift me. She's got plenty of it too. Plenty of gifts.
Thanks, Mark. Talk soon. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
Bye, guys.